lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? That is the title of the closing number of the hit musical Hamilton, which opened just over 10 years ago. With a hip-hop score and a Broadway cast that was primarily people of color, it tells a fresh version of the story of the founding of the United States, focusing primarily on Alexander Hamilton and his allies and enemies and loves. But throughout the musical, there is a recurring thread. What stories get included in our history? How do we know about them? And who tells them? Early in the first act, Hamilton and his revolutionary friends sing that they hope their children will one day tell the story of tonight. Later in the same act, George Washington sings an echo of this. He says, "Let me tell you what I'd wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" And at the close of the musical, Washington's words, "Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" they become the title and the refrain of a song in which Hamilton's widow, Eliza, tells how she spent the rest of her life establishing her husband's legacy by telling his story. I've been thinking a lot recently about history and about which stories get told. I work part-time for the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I spend part of that time helping to maintain and grow the Worship Web, which is an online collection of readings and prayers and rituals and poetry. But I'm also the administrator of the new online hymnal. And my supervisor, the Reverend Erica Hewitt, sometimes finds yet more projects for me to work on. And early last year, she asked if I could help with a project to find out more about the history of certain 19th century Black Unitarians and Universalists. And doing this research made me think about the questions raised by the musical Hamilton. Who tells your story? Why are some stories told and retold and others not? And how do these stories affect our understanding of history? Today, at this crisis point in the history of the United States, these questions feel especially relevant. Relevant, but not new. The 14th century English poet Geoffrey Chaucer had an explanation for why some people's stories are remembered and others aren't. He imagined a goddess of fame who carves people's names on the ice, on a giant mountain made of ice. And if she carves your name on the sunny side of the mountain, the ice melts away and you are slowly forgotten as time passes. If your name is carved on the shady side of the mountain, your memory lives on. So the goddess of fame decides. But outside of Chaucer's dream, it's not just the goddess that decides. There are other forces at work. Some people and some stories are ignored or forgotten because of the biases of the storytellers or of society. And some stories never get to happen in the first place. One of the 19th century Black Unitarians that I researched for my job was the Reverend John Bird Wilkins. I had not heard of him before, and the initial information that I was given about him was simply this. John Bird Wilkins was a Black man who had been a Baptist minister. In 1887, he founded a liberal church in Chicago, and he affiliated with the Unitarians. But he left Chicago in 1888, gave up preaching, and made his living afterwards as an inventor. It turns out, though, that there is much more to his story than that short summary suggests. I learned some more about him by searching through newspapers from the 1880s. I got further information from his entry in the online Dictionary of Unitarian Universalist Biography, and also from a family history that was published by his great-granddaughter, Carolyn Marie Wilkins. And I will tell you what I learned, but since I began this sermon with the question, who tells your story? I do want to emphasize that you will be hearing Reverend Bird Wilkins' story as told by a 60-year-old white man interpreting these sources. I have made choices about which parts of the story to tell, and other people might make different choices. I also want to warn you that the story includes violence and threats of violence. So, with that, let me tell you about John Bird Wilkins. In the mid-1880s, he was a Baptist preacher in St. Paul, Minnesota, and in 1887, he was called to be the new pastor at Bethesda Baptist Church in Chicago. So he moved there with his wife and 2 young children. And pretty soon, he was involved in controversy because Reverend Bird Wilkins started serving open communion at his congregation. That is, he would share communion with non-Baptists. And this may not sound like much to you and me as modern-day Unitarian Universalists, but it was a huge deal for conservative Baptists at the time. And so in July 1887, Reverend Bird Wilkins received an anonymous letter which said, "If the Baptists don't put a stop to your having open communion, we will put a stop to it. You can't live in Chicago. If we can't get you one way, we will get you another." And Reverend Bird Wilkins had other views as well that angered some people. On August 21st, 1887, he preached a sermon that resulted in a front-page story on the Chicago Tribune. Reverend Bird Wilkins' text that Sunday was the episode from the book of Matthew in which Jesus tells a rich young man to give away all his possessions and all of his money because, quote, "it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who was rich to enter the kingdom of God." Using this passage and others, Reverend Bird Wilkins argued that Jesus, the Apostle Peter, and the 4 evangelists were all socialists. "The world will call it socialism," he preached, "but I will call it Christianity." It seems to me that he has a point there. And yet some in his congregation and many of his fellow Baptist ministers did not appreciate this sermon. So when conservative Baptists forced Bird Wilkins to leave his congregation because of his preaching, he found support among the local Unitarians. They helped him found a new congregation, which he called the People's Temple. A newspaper in Wisconsin wrote that this congregation would be the first African Unitarian church in the history of the world. So this was in September and October of 1887. But in January 1888, Reverend Bird Wilkins was once again on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Because on New Year's Day, while he was preaching at the People's Temple, unknown attackers set fire to his house. Another anonymous letter came which said, "We believe you are teaching a religion from the devil. We will kill you before you shall hurt us with your new religion. Our white Orthodox churches tell us to run you out of this town, and you have got to go. This is our last warning." This attack on his home and his family was too much to bear, and Reverend Bird Wilkins did leave Chicago sometime in 1888. The People's Temple did not survive his departure. And records of Bird Wilkins are scanty after that, but he seems never to have led a congregation again. So why is Reverend Bird Wilkins' story not more widely known? One reason, of course, is that even though he founded, as the newspaper said, the first African Unitarian church in the history of the world, it closed its doors less than a year after it opened them. It failed, and we don't tell many stories about failed attempts. But the reason it failed was because it was such a radical idea, its founder had been chased out of town with credible threats of death. The reason why Reverend Bird Wilkins is not well known today is not because of the whims of the goddess of fame, but rather because the people of Chicago would not let him do the work which could have led to a new strain of Unitarian culture in the Midwest. And the local Unitarians were unable or unwilling to help him through this additional crisis. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? The people telling the stories in Chicago in 1888 did not think that any of this was significant enough to keep in memory. A brief controversy in the newspapers, an article about arson, and then silence. And the warmth of the sun melting John Bird Wilkins' name in the ice. Interestingly enough, though, there is a somewhat analogous story that happened more recently. The Reverend Carlton Pearson was a Black Pentecostal minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a large following and with impeccable credentials in the evangelical community. But in the 1990s, he had an epiphany. He could no longer believe that a loving God would condemn anyone to an eternity in hell. In that moment, he realized that he was a universalist. Heaven is universal. Heaven is for everyone. Now, Pentecostals view universalism as a heresy and as work of the devil. Reverend Pearson was denounced by the leaders of his denomination. His colleagues abandoned him, and most of his parishioners left, and he had to sell the church where he had previously preached to 6,000 people every Sunday. But he made a connection with the minister of All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa, and eventually about 200 members of his former congregation started attending All Souls. Reverend Pearson became an affiliate minister there, and he continued to preach at All Souls until his death in 2023. Let me be clear, this merger of congregations, of church-going cultures, was not easy and it was not problem-free. But compare the stories. Here is another Black minister from a conservative tradition whose theology became so liberal that he ended up in common cause with Unitarian Universalists. Reverend Bird Wilkins was mostly forgotten. But what about Reverend Pearson? Well, in 2005, the radio show and podcast This American Life had an episode devoted to his story. UU World Magazine did a feature on him and on how All Souls Tulsa was changed by this influx of former Pentecostals. And in 2018, Netflix released a movie about his story called Come Sunday, which I think you can still watch on Netflix. Why did Reverend Pearson's story turn out differently than Reverend Bird Wilkins's? Well, why does it get told? Partly because Reverend Pearson had the chance to preach his new beliefs. He had a pulpit at All Souls, and eventually at other congregations as well. And to complete the symmetry of the comparison, one of the congregations he ended up leading was a New Thought church in Chicago, the very city that had chased out Reverend Bird Wilkins. And what changed between these two stories was that the arc of the moral universe had bent just a bit closer to justice. And that little bend helped Reverend Pearson succeed where Reverend Bird Wilkins was not allowed to. That little bend in the arc had taken a century of struggle and hard work, but it had an effect. And yet, campaigns of arson and anonymous personal threats against religious professionals are still with us today. I'm thinking, for example, of the congregations whose Black Lives Matters banners and pride flags are regularly defaced and torn down and burned. I think of Cristina Rivera, a Latina woman on the UUA Board of Trustees in 2017, who received anonymous threatening letters from someone who was almost certainly a Unitarian Universalist. We may be closer to justice than we were in the 1880s, but there is still a long way to go. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? Ironically, those words apply to the musical Hamilton itself. Soon after it became a sensation, Hamilton was criticized for not squarely facing the issue of slavery and for completely ignoring the role of Native Americans in the early history of the United States. Lin-Manuel Miranda, the show's creator, agreed with these criticisms, and Leslie Odom Jr., who played Aaron Burr in the Broadway run of the play, spoke about them. He said, "Lin wrote the story that was on his heart to write. I signed on to be a part of a show that I believed in. That was our leg of the race. Now, it's your turn. There's no doubt in my mind that some young kid is going to look at Hamilton and write the show that makes what we did look quaint." And that, I think, is our job as well, to be that young kid, to see the failings of what has been done and said and told before, to understand that every storyteller and every society brings biases to their tales, and to see if we can highlight the voices of people who have been silenced in the past. We can tell the stories of John Bird Wilkins and others like him, and we can include not just what happened, but also what wasn't allowed to happen. And if we retell these stories, and if we hand the microphone to people who may know more about them than us, we will better understand our past and our present. This is relational work. And as our reading today from Melvin Bray tells us, this is how we bend the arc of the moral universe. We are living in historic times, and the stories that we tell are the first draft of history. May we tell these stories well, so that our descendants will know not only what happened in these times, but also what could have been, and what may yet still come to be when we bend the arc closer to justice. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.